Rejection and silent rebuilding. They rejected me. I rebuilt myself in silence. When no one stayed, still something in me remained. At first, what hurts isn't the person's absence, but the silence after them, the echo of unsaid words, the emptiness of what hung suspended between an embrace that never came and a promise that wasn't kept. Rejection has a sound no one hears from outside, but it vibrates within like a constant hum. It doesn't just take someone away, it leaves a space. And in that space, doubt grows. Was I not enough? What if I had done things differently? This is how pain begins to intertwine with identity, and when no one stays, it feels like even who we are starts to fade away with them. Seneca, with the serenity of one who has crossed these absences, wrote, "Rejection from outside is a chance for reunion within." Perhaps the soul already knew this, but the body craved someone. It craved permanence. It craved solace. And when it had none, it froze. Marcus Aurelius, in his silent lucidity, said, "You have power over your mind, not over outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." But understanding takes time, because at first the mind wants control. It wants explanations. It wants the impossible, to go back in time and redo everything. And meanwhile, the pain grows in silence. It grows unnoticed. It grows until it fills everything. The rubble and the inner bloom reconstruction doesn't begin with strength. It begins with rubble. It starts on the ground when you still don't know if you'll get up. It begins with unanswered questions, with sleepless nights, with days where the body is present but the soul is still trying to return. It's a silent process, invisible, like a tree growing underground before breaking through the earth. Nothing seems to change on the outside, but inside, something insists on breathing. It's as if the pain carved out space for something firmer to be born, something that no longer needs to rely on the promises of others. The pain of rejection isn't just the end of something, it's the beginning of something else, something deeper, something that no longer depends on anyone's return, something that rises slowly but with roots that won't break in the first storm. Rejection shows us what we lack, but also reveals what is already ready to be born. And healing begins when we stop asking them to come back, when we stop chasing what's gone. When we sit in the dark and for the first time ask, what remained? What remained is what matters. What remained is what will rebuild us. And however little it may seem now, that little still breathes, still pulsates, still has a name, it's still you. And that is the beginning. The echo of not being chosen and the courage to feel. There comes a moment when the body feels before the mind understands. When someone doesn't choose us, it's not just the absence that wounds us. It's the meaning we give to that absence. It's as if the other's no becomes a distorted mirror, making us believe there's something wrong with us. And this mirror, silent and insistent, begins to follow us. In the way we look in the real mirror, in the way we hesitate to give ourselves again, in the way we, even in the presence of affection, still expect to be left. Rejection creates holes where certainty once was, and the mind, desperate for logic, begins to revisit every scene, every gesture, every word, as if redoing the steps could change the outcome. But history doesn't change, and the repetition of pain only amplifies the silence. And silence, when not listened to with compassion, turns into internal abandonment. Slowly, self-esteem fades, not all at once, but in small doses, one day without hope, another without desire. A forced smile here, an empty gaze there, until no one notices, but something in you has turned to ash. Being rejected doesn't hurt just because the other person left. It hurts because of what it awakens in us, because of the doubt that sets in. Will someone someday see who I am and still stay? This question echoes, and the echo is what hurts. because it spreads into future relationships, into unsaid silences, into attempts to mold oneself to please. But there is an inflection point, a silent and deeply intimate moment when something within us decides to no longer run from the pain, decides to no longer try to erase it, decides to simply feel. Allowing yourself to hurt without self-destructing is an act of courage. It's recognizing that feeling doesn't make us weak. It makes us human. And it's only when pain is embraced that it begins to transform. It doesn't disappear, but it changes form. It stops being a chain and becomes a bridge inward, to what is still here, to what remained even after the departure, because something did remain. Something resisted the rejection. And that something, however small it may seem, is the seed of reconstruction. A reconstruction that doesn't begin with answers, but with the simple and profound decision to remain, even wounded, even alone, even in silence. Remain. The invisible mistake of trying to be better for those who left. After someone leaves, it's common for the body to stay, but the soul to chase after them. And in this often silent pursuit, an effort to change is born. Not a sincere change that blossoms from within, but an anxious attempt to be what might make the other return. We wear smiles that aren't ours, repeat behaviors that don't represent us, mold our essence as if it were flawed, and we call this evolution. But deep down, it's just fear disguised as effort. It's just neediness masquerading as virtue. The mind creates the illusion that if we become good enough, the other will reconsider, will remember, will come back. And in this process, every step of improvement moves further from our center. Because it's not done out of self-love, it's done out of desperation, out of an unconscious desire to be accepted by someone who is no longer there. Seneca firmly warned, "What is done to please is rarely done with virtue." And he was right, because virtue doesn't beg. Virtue doesn't plead for return. It walks with wholeness, even if that means walking alone. When change is motivated by the fear of not being loved, it ceases to be healing and becomes a mask, a heavy mask, one that requires effort to maintain, that consumes emotional energy, that creates an abyss between who we are and who we are trying to appear to be. And this abyss, over time, exacts a high price: self-alienation. We lose touch with our truth, with our boundaries, with our desires, until one day, even if the other returned, they might not recognize who we are anymore. Because even we don't recognize ourselves. Changing for someone means abandoning your own core, and every abandonment, even if it seems strategic, generates loss. The loss of self is silent, but devastating, because at the end of it all, what remains is not what the other saw in us. It's what we managed to sustain when no one else was looking. And that's why reconstruction needs to be intimate. It needs to be honest. It needs to be done not to impress, but to belong to yourself again. That is the return that matters, the return inward, to the inner home that should never have been left. When this reunion happens, what the other thinks or does no longer defines the path. Because the search ceases to be for return and becomes for truth. And truth never demands that you change yourself to fit into someone's heart. Truth only demands one thing: that you don't lose yourself again trying to be who you are not. The silence that suffocates and also saves. At first, silence is a scream that echoes without sound but which the body hears as if it were a siren. It is the sound of absence, the noise of rejection, the sound of a presence that doesn't return. And the more the silence grows, the more it seems to crush you from within, as if time stops with every second that no message arrives, no gesture is made, when all that exists is the emptiness left by those who left. Silence in this first moment seems like punishment. It seems like a penalty, but it is not. It is a passage. Because little by little, silence transforms. It stops being the place of absence and becomes a space of reunion. In the beginning, it hurts because it forces us to listen to what we always muffled. But then it begins to cleanse, to reveal, to show what lies behind the noise of longing, of anger, of doubt. When there is no one else to listen, we begin to listen to ourselves. And this listening is perhaps the most radical act of self-love one can experience. Not listening to justify, not listening to fix, just listening to embrace. Marcus Aurelius knew this. He meditated in silence every morning, not to escape, but to remember who he was, beyond roles, beyond praise, beyond losses. Because silence is memory, but it is also presence. It doesn't bring easy answers, but it brings true questions. And these questions, when not avoided, begin to show paths. Not paths to go back, but paths to move forward with more truth, with more awareness, with more courage. There is an almost secret, yet profoundly transformative practice. Writing what you never had the courage to say, even to yourself. Writing without filter, without fear of seeming weak, without the intention of showing anyone, just to see, just to touch what is hidden. Because sometimes what holds us back the most is not the pain, it is the denial of it. And writing, in this sense, is allowing the soul to speak to the paper, to speak to its own story, to speak to itself with the kindness no one else offered. Silence, then, stops suffocating and begins to save, not magically but gradually. It becomes a refuge instead of a threat. It becomes ground instead of an abyss. And on this new ground made of listening and presence, the soul finds something that had been lost, the ability to trust itself, to sustain its own silence without breaking, to be whole even without answers. Because sometimes what heals is not being heard by others. It is, finally, listening to yourself deeply and remaining, even in the dark, even in silence, remain. What rejection teaches about value and about boundaries. Sometimes it's not the other who rejects us. It's us who, out of fear of losing, fail to choose ourselves. And when this repeats, when self-love is constantly postponed to fit into spaces that don't sustain us, rejection becomes a reflection. It's no longer just the end of a relationship. It's the symptom of something deeper, the lack of clear boundaries, the difficulty of saying no, the habit of allowing, of accepting too much, of swallowing too much, of silencing too much, all to not be left, all to not be excluded. But in this attempt to remain, we end up losing ourselves. The pain of rejection brings to light what was once invisible. It shows the gestures that hurt, but were silenced. It shows the concessions we made without realizing. It shows the tolerance that went beyond what was healthy. And above all, it shows how little we thought we deserved, because no one takes something from us that we protect with clarity. They only invade what we leave open. They only take what we haven't established as sacred. Rejection then can be liberation, but only after anger gives way to lucidity. Only after we stop blaming ourselves and start listening to ourselves. Seneca precisely said, "Virtue does not shout. It simply leaves when it is not respected." And this silent departure is often confused with weakness, but it is not. It is maturity. It is dignity. It is the most integral gesture of someone who has learned that their value cannot depend on the other's gaze, that boundaries are not a barrier against love, but a path for it to flourish with truth, without bargaining, without humiliation, without fear. And this learning, however painful it may be, is what transforms rejection into strength. There is an internal practice that can become a landmark, remembering everything you tolerated for fear of being abandoned. Not to blame yourself, but to understand, to see the pattern, to clearly see where you began to drift away from yourself. Because we can only truly rebuild when we recognize where we broke, and almost always we broke first within. In the place where we stopped saying enough, where we stopped saying not here, where we stopped saying I matter too. Rejection teaches, It teaches about the other, yes, but much more about us, about what we need to protect, about what we can no longer allow, about what we want to build from now on. And this learning doesn't need applause. It doesn't need witnesses. It just needs to be lived with honesty, with firmness, with that kind of love that, even wounded, decides to rise, not to prove anything, but to exist with more presence, with more clarity, and with the silent courage to never again put yourself last. The metaphor of the broken ground and the flower that grew there. There are scenes that feel like endings, when everything collapses, when someone leaves, when what was once certainty turns into silence. In that instant, everything breaks, and the ground which seemed firm cracks. It cracks not just outside, but inside too. The soul bends, the body bows, hope retreats, and pain occupies the space that once was home to dreams. But even in this broken landscape, something insists, something silent, something invisible, something that makes no noise but resists. Because there is life even in the cracks, there is life even in what breaks. Like soil that, after a long drought, finally yields to rain, the soul needs space to breathe. And sometimes it is in the breaking that this space is born. It is there, in the crack, that air enters, that light penetrates, that the flower sprouts. Not despite the pain, but because of it. The flower doesn't emerge where everything is intact. It is born where the earth was wounded, where the structure yielded, where the surface broke. And the same happens with the soul. It needs cracks to flourish. It needs losses to rediscover itself. It needs rejection to remember what truly matters. Pain knocks us off balance, but it also repositions us. It deconstructs, but it also reconstructs. Yet the reconstruction is not like before. It is not a copy of what was. It is something else, deeper, more conscious, more sincere. And even if still fragile, this new version already carries something the previous one didn't. Roots. Roots in its own value. Roots in its own truth. Roots in what, even broken, remained. Because not every loss is ruin. Some losses are just beginnings disguised as endings. Rejection, in this sense, is like the breaking of the earth. It hurts, yes, but it prepares. It prepares the ground. It prepares the space. It prepares the heart. And then, one day, without warning, something blooms. A new way to love, a new way to be with yourself, a new breath, a new gaze, and above all, a new certainty that even broken, you are still fertile ground, still a refuge, still possible, still are. What if all of this wasn't an ending, but a new beginning? What if the pain that made you fall was exactly what allowed you to grow deeper roots? And what if the flower that now blooms only exists because one day you allowed yourself to break? The ground broke, but the soul resisted. And that is already a miracle, already a rebirth, already a flower. They left, but I stayed with myself, and that was the beginning. In the end, what remained was not the emptiness of absence. It was the presence that resisted. It was the silent persistence of one who decided, even amidst shattered pieces, to remain whole. Because there was a moment when everything could have collapsed, and inside it even did collapse. But something remained, something endured, something that didn't depend on external affection, on recognition, on validation. Something essential, something that only those who pass through rejection with open eyes are capable of finding themselves. Seneca said, "No one is more rejected than he who has never accepted himself." And perhaps that's what hurt the most, having expected the other to embrace us when we didn't yet know how to embrace ourselves, having placed in the other's love the hope of finally feeling sufficient. But when that expectation shatters, what remains might seem like devastation. And it is. But it is also liberation, because the pain of rejection, when traversed with awareness, leaves traces of clarity. It shows with precision where we were absent from ourselves. Marcus Aurelius taught us that suffering shapes us, but only if we use it as a mirror. And this mirror, sometimes harsh, reveals the face we avoided, the part of us that nullified itself, that bent, that waited too long. But it also reveals the part that remained, that took a deep breath, that even in silence began to rebuild itself, not to prove anything, but to be, simply to be, with more firmness, with more presence, with more truth. Stoic reconstruction doesn't need applause. It doesn't demand answers. It doesn't seek spectacle. It happens in everyday life, in the simple act of moving forward, in the gaze that refuses to lose itself again, in the choice not to mold oneself to fit. It is silent but potent, because it is made with leftovers, with scraps, with broken memories that, when united, form something new. Something that no longer depends on who stayed or left. Something that at last belongs only to you. And in the end, when we look at everything that has passed, we realize they left. Yes, but I stayed. I stayed with myself. With hands still trembling, but firm. With a heart still sensitive, but whole. With eyes still teary, but clearer. And that was the beginning. The beginning of a love that doesn't leave, that doesn't need to be asked for, that doesn't beg for return. A love that is self-sufficient, a love that is refuge, a love that finally blossomed where before there was only silence. And it was in that silence that I found myself, and it was there that I was reborn.